Good morning, everybody. How are you? Thank you for being here at 9 a.m. on a Friday, first full day of the AMC. My name is Emmy Kane. I am a co-moderator for this morning's plenary, Stories Become Movements, Become Stories, Gender-Based Violence. I've asked Andrea Ritchie, fellow member of Insight, an organization that has played an instrumental role in amplifying stories and building movements around multiple forms of gender-based violence, to join me in introducing and framing this morning's plenary.
Thanks, Emmy. Good morning. Since its founding in 2000, Insight played a significant role in both challenging and shaping narratives of gender-based violence, amplifying and organizing around stories of women of color living at the dangerous intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, and disability, and of interpersonal, state, and global violence, using the power of stories to shape conversations about women of color's experiences of policing, prisons, domestic violence, sexual assault, militarism, and reproductive violence. And over the past year, we've seen the power of survivors sharing stories of sexual harassment, extortion, and assault to expose, challenge, and begin to unseat systemic and structural sexual violence from Hollywood to the halls of Congress as part of the national conversation sparked by Me Too, rooted in the work of Tarana Burke, who you'll hear from at tonight's opening ceremony. And in the ways that Burke describes from her work with young Black women in the South, we know the power of stories to create connections, shift cultures, and build communities of safety and healing for survivors. Over the past 5 years, we've seen the power of stories to fuel the movement for Black lives, to generate not only powerful protest, but lasting movements and visions for liberatory futures. Stories also have tremendous power to exclude, invisibilize, and silence. In my work on police violence, deeply entrenched narratives of state violence is something that is primarily or even exclusively experienced by men who are presumed to be cisgender and not queer, has played a powerful role in rendering racial profiling, police violence, criminalization, and mass incarceration of Black women, gender nonconforming people, and femmes invisible. And predominant narratives of gender-based violence constructed around white femininity erase the realities of persistent and pervasive sexual, domestic, and community violence faced by Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color. Stories also have the power to control. As Black feminists have taught us, controlling narratives of Black women drive violent policing of the presence, voice, and protest of women like Shakisha Clements, Mama Campbell, and Tajaria Becton, who you'll be happy to know 3 years after being violently assaulted by a police officer at a pool party in McKinney, Texas, is graduating from high school this weekend and taking over a local pool to celebrate. These stories are what lead the man who called the police on 4 women golfing while Black to describe one woman as unarmed except for her mouth. Stories about Black women as inherently threatening, violent, deranged, and animalistic are also what drive police killings of women like DeCynthia Clements, who was shot by police just north of Chicago just days before Stephon Clark was killed in his backyard as she was stepping out of a burning car, gasping for air in the midst of a mental health crisis. These stories are what make Black women the group most likely to be falsely perceived as a threat and killed by police when unarmed. Stories about Black women are what keep jurors from believing that Black women, girls, and trans folks can be scared or deserving of protection, leading them to be punished for defending themselves and surviving. They're what keep teachers from believing Black girls deserve support and respect rather than policing and punishment. And controlling narratives are what drive pervasive profiling of Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women, and other women of color in the policing of the sex trades at rates identical to racial disparities in stop and frisk. One set of stats galvanized a movement, the other should too. Finally, stories have the power to inform, transform, disrupt, expand, and inspire. For instance, through the stories told by Insight, Say Her Name, and Invisible No More, we've begun to create new narratives that are inclusive of women, trans, and gender nonconforming people's experiences and resistance to police and state-sanctioned violence. This week is National Say Her Name Week of Action, organized by BYP 100 and a dozen organizations across the country. That's right, give it up. The Say Her Name Weeks of Action calls on us to confront all forms of violence against Black women, girls, and gender nonconforming people. Check it out at bit.ly Say Her Name 2018. And we invite you to join us in centering and elevating these stories as we radically reimagine our visions of safety and build together towards a world in which Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming folks are safe from all forms of violence and are able to not only survive, but thrive.
Stories also become history, and it is amazing to see so many collaboratively designed, decentralized, and accessible archives being built by and for our movements. Archives and story gathering are for us and for future generations to draw on and iterate upon, remix, interpret, challenge, correct, and hopefully grow into something new. It is through stories that we dream and speak the future into being. It's how we contextualize ourselves and draw strength from those who came before us. What stories will future generations tell about this present moment? What kinds of ancestors will we be? And how will the future come to know our complicated and complicating experiences of struggle and resilience and everything in between? For us, here, now, stories can make meaning of experience, reflect back to us things we might know but can't describe, and communicate to the world about our lives on our own terms. For all these reasons and more, who tells these stories and how they're passed down is as important as what is said. Today, we are joined by a group of 5 amazing panelists who are telling stories about the past, present, and future that are shaping movements, disrupting narratives, and inspiring resistance. Through Mirror Memoirs, Amita Swadin, a Just Beginnings Collaborative Fellow, documents and centers the narratives, healing, and leadership of LGBTQI people of color who were raped or sexually assaulted as children. Their commitments and approach to this work stem from their experiences as a genderqueer, femme, queer woman of color, daughter of immigrants from India, and years of abuse by their parents. Emi Koyama, the other Emi. For years, we have been getting emails and texts clearly intended for the other because we have so many people in common, and I'm sure we're saved in more than one phone as just MEK. So literally for like 15 years, I think, we've been getting things meant for each other. Emi Koyama is a multi-issue social justice activist and writer, synthesizing feminist, Asian, survivor, dyke, queer, sex worker, intersex, genderqueer, and crip politics. As these factors, while not a complete descriptor of who she is, all impact her life. She is currently the coordinatrix of the Coalition for Rights and Safety for People in the Sex Trade, a network of community groups promoting self-determination, safety, well-being, and human rights of sex workers and people in the sex trade. Woo. Stop Telling Women to Smile, an international public street art series that tackles gender-based street harassment, created by Tatiana Fazlalezadeh, found on walls across the globe, has built international momentum for tackling violence against women in public spaces. Tatiana is currently the inaugural public artist in residence for the New York City Commission on Human Rights, the art consultant and artist in the Netflix series She's Gotta Have It, and a 2015 Forbes 30 Under 30 recipient. Finally, we are very honored to be joined by Clotine, or Coco, and Ndeye Anderson, the sister and niece of Sawatu Salama Ra, a mother and Detroit community leader wrongfully imprisoned for defending herself, her 2-year-old daughter, and her mother from a violent attack, representing the Free Sawatu Coalition. The coalition brings together individuals and organizations in Detroit working to free Sawatu, support her family, abolish mandatory minimum sentencing, and fight for the health and dignity of all Michigan residents impacted by violence, unjust persecution, and incarceration, especially pregnant women. We'll start by asking each of our panelists to share how the stories they tell shape conversations, confront systemic gender-based violence, and point to a future in which women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people can be safe, survive, and thrive. We will start with Amita.
Okay. Hi.
Woo!
I don't know, is my mic on? Can you guys hear me? No? Yes? Perfect. Okay, great. No? Yes? Yes. Here we go. We're good. I wish I could see all of you. It's always funny when there's lights in your eyes, but come say hello afterwards. It's really nice to be back at the Allied Media Conference. I'm just going to talk over the feedback till they get the sound level right. I came here for the first time in 2010, and I really feel like the work I'm doing now has been shaped by so many conversations I've been in with so many of you and so many of the organizations that have really shaped this space over the years. I come from a community organizing background, grew up right outside New York City, and then lived in Brooklyn for 12 years before moving to Los Angeles. And it is organizations like Insight, like Generation 5, and particularly the people of color who are survivors who helped shape Generation 5. And then the work I did around storytelling, deeply influenced by Mimi Kim and her work with creative interventions, and which was, if you don't know, you should totally check out the massive, amazing, full of wisdom, really big toolkit that's on the website for free. Mimi and her team got funding to, she was so smart about it, right? I think in spaces like this, we can have all the conversations we can't usually have at conferences, right? So we know about the nonprofit industrial complex. Thanks to a lot of Insight's work around the revolution not being funded, we know that that can be such a treacherous space in which to do work that is really aligned with liberation. And I think Mimi offers our movement one of the best models in how to create a project and then get out. And so what Mimi did was she got a fellowship to set up fiscal sponsorship and do some fundraising for a program that had very, very clear goals from the beginning. Her goal, as I understand it, was not to create a nonprofit, but rather to create a narrative or a set of narratives and a model for which many of us who have visions of liberation and a different kind of world can borrow from. And so what she and her team did under the umbrella of creative interventions was travel throughout the US, Canada, and I think a little bit in New Zealand for 6 years. And what they did during that time was they collected audio recordings from people who had been through different kinds of violent crime, including childhood rape and sexual assault, and who had figured out ways to find healing and accountability and, let's just say, the word justice, as fraught as it is, without relying on the state, without relying on police. And then she and her team went around screening listening sessions, using some of the audio clips to train more people on how they actually did the work. And I had the great privilege of being trained when they were traveling around the country. In fact, I think it was at an Allied Media Conference in 2010 or 2012 that I attended one of their workshops first. So I just have to say that, like, our work, nothing that we do is original, and it's built on the shoulders of so many people. And we talk about the work to end childhood rape and sexual assault. You know, there's, in a US context, there's no way to talk about the legacy of that work without talking about queer Black feminism and Indigenous women's organizing. You know, we're living in a context in which every moment that we have an individual getting raped, whether it's in their home or in their school or in their religious institution or in an institution that was supposedly meant to help survivors find some kind of healing and justice, like a mental health hospital or like a prison, right? All of those institutions and the laws that we're operating under were founded in a country that came about because of the genocide and enslavement of Indigenous and African people. So I travel the country a lot right now as a fellow. I hope somewhat in Mimi's tradition. I don't want to start a nonprofit. I'm super clear about that, in case you're wondering. I have been a nonprofit executive director, I have been a nonprofit board chair, and I know who you start to be beholden to when you are doing fundraising work to keep an institution alive. And this is not to, you know, dismiss anyone who's using those tools. I understand the strategic value of those tools, but the work that I really wanted to put forth after being an organizer for 10 years, my work was in youth organizing in New York City with high school students, of course, several of whom would disclose to me their survivorship because I'm so publicly out of being a survivor of childhood rape by my father in my home and having state intervention in my home when I was 13 in a way that caused a lot more violence. And I won't really go into too much of my own story because I feel like it's, at this point, pretty publicly out there. But after hearing disclosures from literally thousands of young people over a decade, and even going to my boss at the time, at a social justice aligned nonprofit that does membership-based community organizing in the Alinsky tradition of door knocking and clipboards and organizing and all of it. And I said to her, who, by the way, was a queer woman of color, right? So we can also have a conversation about the limitation of identity politics. But she said, this is a youth-led campaign. I want you to come to me and tell me what the young people want to talk about. And I said, well, what I'm hearing is disclosures of child sexual abuse and domestic violence in their homes, and they really want to use some of the organizing tools that they're learning to have a campaign about this. And she looked at me and she said, well, that's not a winnable issue. I mean, it's a true story. This was in 2005. That's not a winnable issue, so we can't do that. Now, mind you, at the same time, we had campaigns around ending the presence of armed police officers in schools and ending gentrification in the neighborhood of Brooklyn where we were located. So I'm like, you have the imagination and the radical politic and the drive to aspire towards a world in which police are not in schools and a world in which gentrification doesn't push out poor people of color, but you can't imagine how we could get to a place in which children are not being raped in their homes and their communities. Like, how is that, right? And what does that say to people like myself when I was a child, right? What does that say about our liberation and our bodies and our spirits? What are we actually worthy of? What is the world that we deserve and that we believe we can get to? And we know, right? We have so much analysis in this, if you want to call it one movement. I don't like to use that term. I think there are many movements, but in the world of people in the United States who are aligned with liberation, social justice, who are awake, who are trying to struggle, mostly for our own liberation and then moving outwards from there, right? We know that there's enough analysis in the body of work that we have created over decades together that child sexual abuse is often a cornerstone issue for a long arc of oppression in people's lives, right? And yet we don't have campaign-based organizing around it. So that is what led to the creation of Mirror Memoirs, because I've been in work, when I'm not doing youth organizing work, my other career has been specifically in ending sexual violence work through very corporate-aligned, government-aligned nonprofits that are funded by organizations in the government like the Office of Violence Against Women, which is at the Department of Justice, or FIPSA, which is the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, which is at Health and Human Services, or the Office for Victims of Crime, which is also at the Department of Justice, right? And so when I'm in those spaces, I'm talking to people who are rape crisis counselors, domestic violence shelter counselors, and their higher ups, and then the institutions that work with them, so like law enforcement, right? Prosecutors. And in those conversations, even in the more progressive spaces, there are never any trans people of color in the room, right? And so that's how Mirror Memoirs came about. I've been traveling the country, specifically centering transgender, gender nonconforming people of color who were raped or sexually assaulted as children. And that's another point I would just like to say, that our language really matters, right? I've, even in my work, moved away from using the term child sexual abuse over the past 10 years because I don't really know what we mean by that, right? I think we need to say what we're actually talking about to get people to pay attention. Because even in this Me Too era, we're still not talking about children. And that's really, like, it's such a common experience. The CDC statistic, which is like an underreported federal statistic, says that 1 in 5 children will be raped or sexually assaulted by the age of 18. And the thing is, there's a study by the American Academy of Pediatrics that was published in 2012 that says for gender non-conforming children, and this, I really hope you all hear this point, especially for those male assigned at birth, right? So we can picture who these children are, right? Effeminate boys, trans girls, right? Non-binary people who were male assigned at birth, they are actually the most at risk. It's an American Academy of Pediatrics study. They're not radical, folks. And they have put that research out, and we don't talk about sexual violence that way, even in this so-called movement, right? We talk about a unidirectional arrow of violence from cisgender men towards cisgender women and girls, and completely ignore the fact that it's actually like trans femmes and effeminate boys who are being raped at disproportionately high rates, right? We also don't talk about female perpetration. So I've traveled the country over the past year and a half, interviewing 60 people who are QTPOC, who were raped as children or sexually assaulted as children across 15 different states. And I have heard so many stories of cisgender female rapists. So many. And you know, we know this too, right? Like, how many of you have taken a high school psychology class? Or a college psychology class? Okay, I took a high school psychology class. I grew up in a really blue-collar town. I didn't go to no fancy high school, right? So like just a basic high school psychology class. We watched the movie Sybil. Perhaps you've heard of it. I'm pretty old, and it was made like right around the time I was born or shortly thereafter. It's an old film. It's not a radical film. That movie is why we know there is a mental health condition or state of being called dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And the reason we know about it is because Sybil was repeatedly raped over many years of her childhood by her mother. So I'll stop there because I know I'm out of time, but there is just so much to say around when we talk about intersectionality, when we talk about sexual violence. I believe we really need to center children, and we need to be willing to listen to the complexity that unfolds. And so I have an offering to make to the community. We'll be releasing, we've just transcribed all 60 of the interviews, and we're coding them, me and my board, together, and we will be releasing some of the audio files, hopefully in a podcast. Those of you who know podcasting should talk to me. I don't know anything about podcasting. But hopefully in a podcast over the coming year, and I'm really excited for the ways I hope that our stories together can help shift the work that we're all doing. Thank you.
Oh, is this on? Yes. Hello, people. Hi. Can I get the clicker? Clicker? You want this mic? Clicker. I want the clicker.
The clicker. Oh, you want the clicker?
It's in the file, right? Okay, how do I use this thing now? Ta! Okay, yay, that's me. Hi, people. My name is Emmy. This is Adri. She's the cutest puppy ever. I have my penguin hat. So I've been an activist since like mid to late 90s around sexual violence, and that was my main work. And I'm also being involved with a Portland-based sex work organization called Danzine that closed in 2006, and doing lots of, yay, Danzine, and being involved in lots of sex worker organizing, and focusing on, trying to work for the people who are less privileged within sex, in the sex trade, so that, and because so much of the sex worker movement focused exclusively on the decriminalization, the same way the gay movement focused on marriage, or the women's movement focused on abortion rights, which is like, I totally support all those, but it didn't actually reflect the priorities of people who are struggling. So just trying to bring that into that. Anyway, I'm going to talk about like different things like sex trade. Sex trade is a neutral term that we use because it describes actions, not the who people are. Because like when you call people sex worker, that makes it about identity, and sometimes people don't identify. People are doing it for survival, etc. Or see as like not the word that that it's just a job. It's not who I am. So we talk about sex trade, and also we can use the term to talk about people who are in a different combination of the circumstances, and how people are engaged in sex trade for the same reason other people are engaged in other kind of work, which is sometimes you choose things you want to do. Sometimes there's so much economic pressure that you have to do things, or sometimes you're actually being trafficked for sexual labor. So all those things are included in sex trade because this describes the act. So, and I'm going to skip some of the terms, but the criminalization is a concept that within the sex worker movement, as I say, I feel like people think exclusively about decriminalization, so that we have laws against prostitution. Why shouldn't the consenting adults be able to pay each other for sex? And I totally support the argument, but criminalization is actually much bigger than that, because it's not just the law. The laws are, designed to be racially, non-discriminatory, but the actual practice of that is obviously like, racialized and based on the class and all the other factors, right? So that we have the criminalization is something much bigger than the specific laws about prostitution, but how the communities are being targeted as criminal suspects, as the people who are, and the laws against prostitution happen as a result of the criminalization, not the other way around. Right, so I think of that, those criminalization as something that can continue, even if suddenly all the laws against prostitution is abolished. We'll still see the people in the sex trade being criminalized, and especially people on the street, people who are people of color, trans people, immigrants, who are engaged in sex trade being criminalized, even in the absence of the laws specifically against prostitution. So I'm part of this coalition. I am a coordinatrix, and I really like that title. And so we are the organization, a network of organizations in the community organizations in Seattle, King County area. We actually work on some of the state issues, so it would be nice to have like a statewide coalition, but we don't have the money to organize elsewhere because I can't travel. I don't even drive. And this is like the coalition of, sex worker organization like SWAP and SNAPS, which is like does the street outreach for the women who are working in the street, or sex workers and people in the sex trade on the street. We have like RadCare is actually a sponsored project of AMC, or the Allen Media Project, so yay. And we have the people who are doing HIV work, people who are doing queer and trans work, people who are doing sexual violence, anti-violence, domestic violence, sexual assault work, and we have different communities of color organizations and queer communities of color organizations that are involved in this coalition. And we're trying to expand, and there are also like other organizations that are not formal members, but they do lots of work with us. And we have like some of the legal people, the Legal Voice, which is like a feminist, like some big like mainstream feminist legal advocacy organization that actually supports decriminalization of sex trade to protect rights and safety. So this is something that we started like a little over a year ago, and we're doing that. We're practically out of money right now, but we're trying to get the grants. And anyway, so one of the important things that we decided at the beginning was that this idea of the anti-criminalization, so that instead of saying we want to decriminalize prostitution, which actually is not practical as a something that can be done in a short term, and also it's something that makes it about pro and con and for or against decriminalization, and that makes some of the organizations unable to participate in the coalition, or that they are not able to join the coalition that explicitly advocate for decriminalization because of how their board is composed, how their funding sources are. If you're receiving government funding, that makes it really difficult, etc. So we came up with this statement, and this is actually, it's a compromise, but it's also more radical, because instead of saying decriminalization, it actually talks about criminalization, which is that, we're recognizing the harm is caused by criminalization, and that we want to reduce criminal justice involvement in the lives of people in the sex trade. And this can include not just the law against prostitution, but it can include all kinds of laws. It has to do with immigration law. It can be it can be housing, and the ways that the human trafficking is used, or the sex trafficking of youth is used as an excuse to go after homeless encampments, things like that. So we have a bunch of issues. I'm not going to go into those. So instead of just decriminalization, we have the options to pursue so many different policies. We're involved in HIV, transmission law reform. We're involved in fighting homeless encampment sweeps, because displacing people makes people more vulnerable, right? We're involved. We almost passed a law to protect people in sex trade when they are working. They experience emergency while they're working and have to call 911 for medical or police, and it didn't work. But we got pretty far in that for the first year we're doing it, and we're doing all kinds of and this is not the whole list of it, all kinds of different issues at state, county, and city levels. And so I was really happy to be doing this work. It's only 10 hours a week work, but doing advocacy for people in sex trade. And it's something I was actually being paid, even though it's for like 10 hours a week, but I was actually being paid for something I've been doing all my life, or like, for the last 15 years or something without pay. So that was amazing. And that we actually got like the really strong partnership with all those community groups to be able to do that. And so that was great. And then this thing happened. And so, I mean, do you find it disgusting that we have all those like, survivors of sex trafficking standing next to somebody that he should not be, around these survivors, right? That's kind of disgusting to me, but anyway. So this law, supposedly about fighting the trafficking of, especially of the sex trafficking of youth on the websites, is actually a law that targets the platforms where people can use to advertise for sex worker, for sex worker can advertise to find clients, find job, and also there are websites being shut down that are for screening clients, so that there are certain websites that people use to share the information about bad people who you should say no to. But those websites are being shut down. Social media accounts are being shut down, and if they are using it to work, because now those platforms are afraid that they will be sued for that. So all those things are, this law passed and was signed in April, and that caused immediate crisis in the community. So let's see. And so this is a survey that we were planning to do anyway, and we got the funding to do it, and it was we got $5,000 to give people as a compensation for participating in the survey. And that was great, but we were just sitting on it because we wanted to make it perfect. And then this thing happened in April, and I was like feeling, oh, my job is, I'm supposed to be advocating for people in sex trade and policy, and I wasn't, obviously I can't stop the federal law that's happening in DC, and I have no influence there. I have no ability to organize around that. And then I realized I was feeling powerless. And then I realized that, oh wait, we have $5,000 in the bank right now, and all the people in the community are struggling financially. So we should just do this. And so we just rushed this survey and started it right away. We opened it with an event specifically for trans and gender non-conforming people in sex trade, in partnership with Gender Justice League, which is a trans and gender diverse organization. And we held this emergency gathering for people to come and talk to each other, and we and the Gender Justice League together came up with like $150 per person for taking the survey. So and people were sharing this online. They were like, I can't believe this. Like, why would anyone pay trans sex workers $150? So this is too good to be true. It must be some kind of scam. They're trying to catch the trans people, trans sex workers. And so I had to go online and say, no, this is for real. Like, look, like this number is for Gender Justice League. You know this organization. They hold the trans pride. So this is for real. And anyway, like we were able to put just collect the information when we needed it, and put cash into people's hands when they needed it. So that was yeah, I wish we could give people more money. And also we had some individual donation from the local sex worker activists to me to use to basically pay people for if their phone is being cut off or something that I could do that. So anyway, this is a flyer or the poster that we made, and based on the Silence Equal Death and the poster earlier in AIDS crisis, and it was about that poster sent different message to the community, the different communities. So for the gay community at the time, people when they saw the pink triangle, they knew what the symbol was, and when they saw Silence Equal Death, they knew exactly what that was about, because people were dying. But people outside of the community didn't know what it was, and it was kind of mysterious. It encouraged them to find out what it is. Similar to that, people in the sex worker activist community and our friends and allies know what this is. But for other people, this is it doesn't make sense. They don't understand what it is. So, red umbrella being the symbol of the violence, stopping violence against sex workers. We also made this postcard and distributed at May Day, March, and other things. I have some of those. I don't have a whole bunch of them, but I probably have 30 of them. If you want it, you can come and get it from me, or you can email me, and I can send it to you. I have my business card and stuff over there. So Anyway, that's me.
And this is me. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here very early in the morning on Friday in Detroit, here with all of you. I am an artist. All right, there we go. I'm an artist based in Brooklyn, New York, but I'm originally, Brooklyn? What? All right, Brooklyn. I'm originally from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Oklahoma City doesn't get the same response. All right, that's cool. I am from Oklahoma. I am a daughter of a black woman from Oklahoma. I'm a daughter of a Persian man from Tehran, Iran. And I am someone who does work around race and gender in my artwork. I'm a painter, an illustrator, a muralist. I do work that is centering my experiences, the experiences of people from my community, because I love them, because I want us to be treated better, because I want us to be free. I want us to be able to move throughout the world freely and safely and securely. In 2012, I did a project called Stop Telling Women to Smile. That project is still going on. It's an ongoing series where I interview individual people about their experiences with street harassment, particularly gender-based street harassment, catcalling, the way that we yell at women, talk down to women, abuse women, sexualize women, harass women in the streets. I started this project with my own experience. Street harassment is something that I've been experiencing since I was a child, especially when I moved to Philadelphia. From Oklahoma City, it became an everyday experience for me. And I didn't like it. And I wanted to say something about it. I wanted to do something about it. And so I began to use my artwork to do that. Once I realized that my experience was resonating with other people, that other people were having similar experiences to me, I decided to expand it and to talk to other folks about their experiences. Because even though we were relating in some way, I do understand that my experience, being who I am, Tatiana, is not the same as everyone's. Any person's walking down the street who identifies as a woman is going to have a different experience based on who they are, what they look like, where they come from, how they present. All of these things influence how they are experienced. And so it was important for me because I was recognizing that the national conversation that I was seeing around street harassment seemed to be coming from a very particular narrative. This narrative of a cis, hetero, white femme woman being harassed mostly by men of color. So it was important for me to talk to other folks, to expand that conversation, to complicate that conversation, and to say this is what's actually happening to various people for various reasons and to various extremes. The picture behind me is of one of my pieces. This is pasted in Brooklyn. It is of Dean, who is from Atlanta, and the piece reads, "My masculinity is not a threat to yours." This is one of my favorite pieces from this series because I think it is a complete opposite of that narrative that I just described to you. Dean is someone who is experiencing street harassment, has been, but for a very different reason. And so the reason that I am interviewing people and drawing them and putting their quotes onto posters and putting them out into the street is because it is confrontational, for one. I could draw these people and I could put them up in a museum or a gallery or my studio or my bedroom. But what good would that do when we're talking about something that happens in the public space? So I put it up in the public space to confront people. So that you're walking down the street, you see this piece, and hopefully it does something to you. If you're somebody who perpetrates this behavior, hopefully it's something that you stop, that you consider, that you think about, and you change your behavior. If you're someone who is experiencing street harassment, hopefully you come across this and it comforts you. It gives you some type of defense, some type of solace. This is Zari. This is pasted in Chicago. And the piece reads, "My worth extends far beyond my body." For me, the importance of telling these stories about street harassment and these everyday moments that we live with these different oppressions is important because it is not disconnected from these larger systems of oppression, these larger experiences of oppression. I think telling a woman to smile is on the same spectrum as a woman experiencing physical violence in the street, experiencing physical violence anywhere else. And for what reason? Why? How? Sexism does not work alone. Sexism is going to overlap with other systems of oppression. So sexism and racism, sexism and transphobia, sexism and homophobia, fatphobia, all of these things work together. And so we can't talk about one thing without talking about all the other things. Oh, my clicker stopped working. Sorry, y'all, I turned it off. Oh, there we go. And so I travel around the country. I talk with people individually, I talk with people in groups, and I ask them very specific questions. What is it that you go through? What is it that you experience? And what do you have to say to the public about who you are, about what you go through, how you've been treated, and how you want to be treated? My work is about, I have a friend who said to me that your work is basically about clapping back at people, which I agree to some extent, but I also think that it is about understanding why these things happen and trying to break that down as well. And I think that storytelling is a very powerful tool to do that. So if I'm talking to someone who is a 16-year-old girl who lives in Miami about her experiences with street harassment, and then I talk to someone who is a trans woman in the middle of America and her experiences, or I'm talking to an older black woman in South Central LA about her experiences, we're talking about the same issue, but because we're talking about it in these different ways from these different experiences and viewpoints, we're breaking it down a little bit more, and we're understanding the why of how it's happening and various reasons. My work has extended a little bit over the past couple of years to talking more about how people are experiencing oppression that extends beyond sexual harassment. This piece says, "Here, been here, not going anywhere," and it's based in El Paso, Texas. Oh, thanks. Again, storytelling. This is a woman that I met, had a conversation with, and drew her photo and put it up outside on a wall. A part of this stuff, when you think about art and you're a portrait artist, you think about visibility, you think about representation, which I think is an important part of it. But again, it's more than just their face and them being represented, it's their words as well, what they have to say, and putting that out into the street. This is a piece that I did in Oklahoma City in November 2016 after the election. Again, changing the narrative. So who's an American? What is an American? Putting this in a very red Republican state that is very white, that is very racist, I know because I grew up there, is an act of defiance, an act of comfort to the people that I am representing in these portraits, all of whom I know, I talked to, had a conversation with. Yeah, that's it. All right. Thank you.
We're just pulling up a video. It's coming, because we're at the Allied Media Conference and we have media magic.
a sunny day. My daughter, she's in the car playing with the steering wheel.
Open your heart.
Sometimes magic is tricky, but it always shows up.
It's happening.
I was we were just sitting on a porch. It was a sunny day. My daughter, she's in the car playing with the steering wheel. She had come to our house very upset, very angry. She started yelling at me, screaming at me, cursing at me. I'm asking her to leave, just go, and she wouldn't. And so the next thing that she did was ram her car into my car. That shocked fear in me, and I jumped and got my baby out the car. My mother, who was also standing very close to me, wasn't able to run.
She's using her car as a weapon. When I could not move, that's when I was the most frightened. She was so close to hitting me that I could feel the car on my clothes.
That's when I made the decision to reach for my firearm that was unloaded with no bullets. I was afraid. And I told her, you have to leave now. Something that we're fighting against is the way the world views what Black fear looks like. I think that if I was somebody else, maybe, just maybe, they would have identified with when I said I was afraid. My name is Sawatu Salamara. I'm a mother, I'm an organizer, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife. I've dedicated my life to serving others, my entire life. And so, I'm not thinking of myself when I heard that verdict. I can do it, but I thought of my children. That's the pain, to have my first son and to not be with him for the first 2 years. Let me have this baby on the outside with my family, with my community. I don't feel like I'm in this situation for nothing. There's something I'm supposed to learn, and so I want to do my best to learn everything that it is that I'm supposed to learn to help the next person, and the next person, and the next person, so that they won't have to go through this. Their children won't have to go through this.
So Coco and Ndeye, thank you for being with us this morning so early. Sawatu's story is unique and uniquely painful, and at the same time, similar to so many Black women's stories of surviving, defending themselves, and being punished for it, like Marissa Alexander, Cece McDonald, Kiwi Haring, who didn't survive, and so many more. What is Sawatu's hope and your hope in the Free Sawatu Coalition in putting her story out of surviving and being punished?
What she wants to get out is the treatment of
incarcerated pregnant women. How they're treated, how they're shackled to go to get examined, how they have to give birth alone, they can't breastfeed, just the treatment of pregnant women locked up, colored women locked up, how the system works. My sister has no criminal background, was licensed for her gun, and it was unloaded. And somebody came to our mother house and threatened her and her child and my mother. And she did what anybody else would have done. And now she's serving 2 years. She had her baby May 21st, a healthy baby boy. But my sister didn't get the correct treatment after you have a baby. You know, one of her ladies that she locked up with had a baby. And they won't let the family get the baby, so they put the baby in foster care. And the family is waiting at the door for the baby. So just the treatment. We're finding out that the justice system doesn't work for us. People of color, women of color, they don't see us as being scared. I guess we just gotta be strong or mean all the time. But that's not who we are. That's just some stereotype that was forced on us. And the reason that we have to be strong or mean all the time is because we got so many people or things coming at us that we gotta stand our ground. But then when we stand our ground, we get locked up. You get taken away from your children. You have to give birth by yourself, her husband, me, nor her mother. Nobody could be with her.
And we didn't know that she had the baby.
Until a couple of days after the baby was born.
They did not call. They didn't send an email or not. They couldn't. They didn't want.
They didn't even let her call us in the hospital. She had to wait till she got back to prison.
Where's her son now?
Or with her husband. I feel, well, Suwatu feels that her being incarcerated is a hard pill to swallow, but that maybe deep down inside that this is something that was meant for her to do to help other people, to help other women. Maybe it just came at not a good time. You want to say something?
So, I can't imagine how hard it is to talk about this and at the same time carry forward her desire for her story to move us forward to a different world.
Right.
Love you too.
You gotta excuse me, I'm a crybaby. And I miss my sister. I haven't seen her since March 1st. Her birthday is next month. She missed her baby's birthday, which is in March. She calls home all the time. It's just, I don't know. The justice system is not for us. And that's another thing she wants to work on, getting the laws changed, like the 2-year mandatory sentence that she had to do, or just how whoever gets to the police station is the victim first. And it's not always true. It's not. And that Black women can be scared. We can be scared. We have feelings, emotions, and we're strong, but we're not always strong. And it's okay.
And our strength is used against us.
It is.
Suwatu also wants to move forward some legislation that would change the way that pregnant people are able to give birth. Obviously, the goal is to not have anyone
Stay
in
with
cages.
their babies longer.
And
You only
not
get
have anyone in
24
cages.
hours with your baby after you give birth.
And what would the law change that she's hoping to get passed?
At least a little bit longer, more than 24 hours. You get to breastfeed your baby, or at least pump and put the milk up so your family can get can get the milk for the baby. A better nursery inside the prison so that when you do come visit your mother, that it doesn't look so much like a prison, that it can look like your house or a toy room, you know, something to make it feel more welcoming, not so prison style.
And there's a lot of conversation right now about parents being ripped from their children,
Yes.
right? And that's been the experience of black women in this country since 1619,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And there's so much about Siwatu's story that tells us that we need to fight for a world where you don't give birth in shackles, you don't give birth in a cage, and you can be free to be with your child and be free to defend yourself.
Yes.
And what would you and Siwatu want the folks here to do in honor of her birthday, in honor of her baby's birthday, in honor of her child?
So I don't know what day that we having a baby shower for the boy, and it's like a community. It's not like a gift. It's just like to welcome him, cause I don't think everybody's seen him yet. So it's just like to know, like he's here. So you can go to, I don't know, like what's the website?
It's behind you.
Yeah, you can go there, or you can email one of the people that's like in the middle, like Il or or Michelle, and they'll give you the information to help us out with anything or be involved with us.
She just wants the word to get spread out about her story plus other women's story, because it's just not her. It's not. If I can remember, it was at least 20 or 21 pregnant females incarcerated with her. So that's gonna be 21 babies getting taken away from their mother, who probably won't see their mother for some years. So just to get that out, just pray for my sister, pray for her baby, send positive thoughts. Not so much as gifts, but what can you do physically or mentally for her or the baby? Pass out some paperwork. Say you're gonna teach him how to play basketball. Tell him you're gonna teach him how to spell his name. Anything. Just spread the word about my sister. Talk about it, tell her story.
She also like letters. You could send her a letter, just for saying how, I don't know. You could send her prayers.
You can JPay her, send her pictures. She wants pictures.
She loves pictures.
She wants to know what's going on.
So if we have a meeting or stuff that involves Siwatu, we'll take pictures to show her we's working for her, and that she's still involved. She's not going nowhere. So anything that you can do, we'll tell you.
So we encourage you through the conference to take pictures, signs, fists raised, love, and solidarity, and post it with hashtag #FreeSiwatu. And then can we just take a minute now to just send so much love to Siwatu, her newborn, her child, her sister, and her niece. Give it up.
Her mother's up there too.
And her mom.
I feel like I need to touch it.
That was a good picture, I guess.
I know she heard that, and I know she felt that.
Got a little clip of it to send. So we're gonna do a couple questions, and then we'll open it up for probably just a few from the audience. Stories can be powerful, obviously, but they also have the potential to limit our imaginations about the real complexity of people's lives and the multiplicity of experiences that are possible in any particular situation. We're taught that every good story has a protagonist, a villain, a crisis, a resolution, and through our own lived experience, we know that the truth is much more complex. So the question here is, how can we mobilize the power of stories to expand imagination, disrupt dominant narratives, instead of erasing complexities and essentializing experiences? And then also, how do you in your work highlight and focus on resilience and power in stories about violence and harm?
Two different questions.
I know.
I can start. So stories in terms of being limiting, I think I spoke to this a little bit in my opening remarks, that the current media narrative is around a unidirectional arrow of harm from cisgender men towards cisgender women and girls. And what I have found, when you're willing to listen to the truth of a complex and diverse body of survivors' stories, and particularly when you center children who have been raped, the lines become blurry so quickly around who is a quote-unquote perpetrator or a person who has raped somebody and who is a survivor. In my own story, my father's a survivor. He was raped as a little boy. My mother's a survivor. She was sexually assaulted as a teenager, specifically of childhood rape and sexual assault. And they both were, in different ways, people that harmed me in my childhood, right? And so when we say that we should have movements that are led by survivors, and we want to politicize survivors as an identity, which is something I'm committed to doing, I think we also just need to be careful around, is that enough, right? I testified against our Attorney General at his confirmation hearing, and to my, that's not why I share that, thank you. But the woman to my left, who was a witness for the Republicans, was the mother of a young woman who was raped and killed by a complete stranger, and who has aligned with the Republican Party and our carceral system as a way to get justice for survivors. So she, through her daughter, is a survivor. But is that enough, right? Is it enough to say that we want movements just led by survivors, period? I don't think so, because that's how we get the justice system that we have today, particularly to Tatiana's point earlier around white women who are survivors, right? And let's be honest, Asian Americans as well, too often, and I say that as an Asian American, I mean, the Survivors' Rights, Sexual Assault Survivors' Rights Act that was passed in 2016 was championed by Amanda Nguyen, a Vietnamese American young woman who was raped on her college campus, and put a stake in the ground around rape kit testing as the most important federal priority. And I mean, I'm not here to tell other survivors what we should or shouldn't be doing to find healing for ourselves, but I will say when we champion rape kit testing as the #1 priority federally for funding, it is a way to get more people, in theory, into the carceral system. That's not my vision of justice, because in hearing stories from other survivors in mirror memoirs, I hear people who were raped in prison, right? Raped in the juvenile detention system, raped in the mental health hospitals that they were put into against their will. And so that's not something I can support. So I think if we're going to create a movement based on stories to end childhood rape and sexual assault, it has to be intersectional, it has to be abolitionist, it has to be aligned with an analysis of institutional harm as well, right? It's not enough to just say, I'm a survivor and so I get to lead this work.
Hello? Am I on? Okay, good. Hi. So I mean, I want to mirror like what Amita just said. Like for a long time, I think at least since like around 2007, 2008, when the anti-trafficking and when the trafficking, Victim Protection Act was reauthorized, and was the more focus was placed on domestic sex trafficking of minors, which like any sex trade, even if it's like something the youth is doing to, on their own without anybody else involved,
is considered to be trafficking because they're minors and they're not able to consent to sex, even though they can still be arrested for prostitution, which is ridiculous, another story. But so ever since that time, like we've had like the narrative of the sex trafficking, any sex trade done by youth, done by people who are vulnerable, to be like, to be told in the mainstream media through the Hollywood movies and politicians and media as the story of very young, like elementary school age or young, very young white cis straight supposedly girls in suburbia being kidnapped by men of color from the cities and be forced into prostitution, which is not to say it doesn't happen, but that's very uncommon example of like sex trafficking or youth engaged in sex trade. What's more common is the people who come from background that's already been marginalized because of the abuse in homes, because of racism, because of prisons and immigration system breaking down families. The people put into that situation. It could be queer and trans youth who are running away or being thrown away from homes because of homophobia and transphobia, and there's nothing else in the community that can support them, and the child welfare system is completely broken. So that, it's all of those combined result in people's vulnerability, but that's not the stories we hear, right? And what we hear in the mainstream media is that this like bad pimps like going after the youth and taking them away and forcing them into prostitution, and that's just not, the reality for so many people, right? So, I feel like in my presentation, I felt like rushed and I didn't get to actually talk about any of the stories. So I just want to recover that a little bit. I actually brought like a bunch of quotes from the survey, especially about the Boston Cesta, with the website being shut down by the government because of the, just anti-trafficking measures. But the, impact that's happening is that, people are suddenly losing a way to make a living, right? I mean, any time you take away people's income, that's going to put them in so many of the problems. That's financial and people struggling to pay rent and pay for cell phone. Which when you're a sex worker, if you don't have a cell phone, that's a huge problem. I mean, that's a problem for many people, but especially for people in sex trade. We have people being people who are who have to stop screening potential clients because they can't afford to say no to anybody anyway, and they have to take the people who are in the blacklisted because they've abused sex workers in the past, and you have to accept them because you're afraid that you won't get anybody else. There's one person who actually told us that she had to take back someone who sexually assaulted her in the past because she was really desperate to get that. And yet, and some of the clients actually realize that they have the, advantage in negotiation, so that they will, call back and say, hey, several months ago you told me that you won't do this, but how do you feel about it now? I know you're desperate, right? We have pimps calling sex workers and, saying that, hey, I know you can't find clients, but I have a whole list of the numbers of the clients who, I can help you for a cut. So we have all those situations where the law that's designed and intended to protect the victims of trafficking causing more vulnerabilities. And this is something that's not just happened because of this law. It's been happening for a while. But what I'm thinking now is that with the survey, and we're not the only ones surveying this issue, our survey is actually much broader and seeing the impact of different surveys, different policies. But because this law has created so much hardship in the community, and it targets people who were thought to be more privileged within the sex trade. So people who are working online, having advertising and website profiles and online, who were in a better position to screen people, they are also being targeted. Now, when they come down to the street, then the people who are already on the street actually suffer much more. So it affects everybody, but it's impacting people whom we thought previously that were more privileged, more stable, had more options, are also suffering. And this is, I feel like that we are finally coming to the point where so much damage is done that we may actually be able to use this as an opportunity to change the conversation, to point out that all those policies they've been passing in the last 10 years was not based on what the community was saying. It was based on what the society thinks is a problem, which is that men of color, black men, Latino men, coming and kidnapping white girls was seen as a problem, or even if they don't say it, that's implicitly that was their message and the representations. And we're finally, maybe this is the opportunity to finally change the narrative, finally focus on how it's impacting people and the reality of the sex trade, which is like, it's a labor market like any other, but it's like, it's a labor market of the very low end of the society, which means there are lots of abuses, and we can address those abuses by protecting people's rights and safety. So.
Does anyone else want to take that question, or we're going to move to the next question?
I wanted to say something about resilience because you had asked that, and it's a separate question. But just very quickly, I will just say two of the questions. I asked the same 15 questions of everyone in Mirror Memoirs, and two of the questions are, if you went through a portal into another dimension, and in that dimension capitalism didn't exist, and all you had to do from the minute you woke up until the minute you went to sleep was work on becoming more whole and more well in your own vision of that, and you had a bottomless container with you, and it had every material and spiritual resource that you need to heal, what would be in the container and where would it come from? And people have the most beautiful answers. And then another question I ask is, what's your personal vision for how humanity can end child sexual abuse? And that one is more varied, but everyone has an answer. And I think what's really significant to me about all 60 stories is that at no point does anybody say, we need more jails. Like literally not a single person, and I didn't lead that, right? I didn't go around cherry picking people who I knew were abolitionists. I met complete strangers in this project who found out about it through word of mouth. I think that's really significant, right? When you center, this is the thing about intersectionality as a praxis, not just a theory, right? When you center people who are trans and gender nonconforming, Black, Indigenous, people of color, many of whom are undocumented, many of whom are incredibly low income, they already know the carceral system doesn't work. It's harming them in many different parts of their lives, right? And so we have answers. We have the wisdom within us to figure out what we actually need. We just need the space in which to see each other. And I think our resilience, violence begets isolation, so healing is about intimacy. Right? Healing is about connection, and I have had the great privilege of having my wounds as a childhood rape survivor be very exposed so that people come and find me from all over the country for 10 years now, and I can tell you how much it has healed me to be seen and be loved from that place. I want that for everyone, right? We need to be able to see each other, and that's why I think we need to politicize our identity of survivorship so that we can break our isolation, right? Break our shame, break our stigma, and figure out, if not prisons, then what are we fighting for,
Thank you. We just have one more question up here. We saw the power of Suwatu telling her own story, right? And the media covering it in the way that she wanted to tell it. And the power of Tatiana, you putting out people's own words and kind of, as you said, putting it in people's faces, right? And of sex workers telling their own stories and survivors telling their own stories. Often my question to you all is about when the mainstream media calls, right? And is like, yeah, they call me, they're like, yeah, we can talk about police sexual violence, but I really want to talk to a survivor of police sexual violence. And I'm like, well, one, you're talking to one, but two, you can be a survivor and an expert at the same time, just FYI. And then secondly, there's something that always feels exploitative about that they don't want to talk about unless they can personalize it to one person and really kind of throw that story out as one, the story, and two, one that doesn't allow that person a lot of power and agency. And so some groups have strategies to deal with that. I know the Young Women's Empowerment Project, who have been a long-time AMC informer and participants, put out reports where young women told their own stories in the way they wanted to the people they wanted to in an empowered setting, and put those stories out and said, these are the quotes you can use when you want to do a media story. This is the frame we want you to put on it. We're not going to bare our souls to you and then risk you twisting our quotes up and our stories up every time. This is how you do it or not. So do you have suggestions of other strategies to keep the power of the stories of survivors when mainstream media gets a hold of them? Maybe starting with Free Suwatu.
Well, with my sister, she has a media team. So they they know who to talk to and who don't to talk to. Because they will twist your words around. So my sister is very, very lucky to have like a whole community, a whole team for media, for this and that. So she has the media team and they know who to talk to. Because we don't want her words to get twisted around. We don't. And we don't just want it to be focused on her case. I mean, we do, but we know there's thousands more of Sawatus, of mothers that's about to give birth in prison, that are just pregnant in prison right now. So, yeah. She's lucky enough to have a media team to let, because I know that some news people just want to come in just to get in. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, well, I think two things. I think that having one story kind of represent an entire issue or community can be damaging in some ways. But I think that it also allows other people to tell their story. So if there is one person, if there is one thing, one situation that's there, and it is put out into the public in a nationwide sense, depending on how that story came about, if that person was allowed to tell their own story, then I think that allows other people to do that as well. I think about this in my own work as someone who talks with people and tries to be very intentional about the fact that I'm reflecting their imagery. I'm grateful to people all the time for allowing me to hear their stories and to draw them and to put their faces into the public space, because I couldn't do my work. My work wouldn't exist if they didn't allow me to do that. But I also have to step back and also recognize that and try to make sure that I'm not exploiting people, that I'm not exploiting their experiences, that I'm not just picking people and making sure that I have this type of person and this type of person into the series just so it looks diverse, but to make sure that my intentions are good, that my intentions are real, and that I'm acting of service. And to like always check myself. I think we always have to check ourselves as well. And I just think that because I am leading this thing, that I'm perfect and that I'm great, but that the people who are involved and participating have a huge part. They make the whole thing, right? And so as leaders of these movements, or as faces of these movements, to kind of check ourselves and make sure that we're doing the right thing as well. So I can criticize the media, but in some form I'm creating media as well. So what am I doing? And at the same time, to kind of go back to the other question, I think that storytelling is very important when it comes to these movements, but it doesn't work alone. I think that what I am doing and my work is important as an artist. I'm creating art, but I don't plan on changing street harassment or ending street harassment as an artist by myself. I am doing a particular thing by trying to change culture and behavior and the way that we act individually towards other people, but I'm not working in policy, I am not working in law, I am not working in any of those things, and I steer away from that stuff, because when it comes to solutions for street harassment, I think one of the first things that we try to think about is criminalizing people, and that's what I don't want to do. I actually actively work against that. But I know that what I do as an artist has to work in conjunction with other people as well. Movements don't work just from one field, right? So storytelling is an important part of that, but I need everyone else that's around me working in this to work together. So yeah, and in doing so, again, like I said earlier, it's about changing the narrative. So not positioning just that one story, but also having all these other stories from all these other identities and other people to break it down. Street harassment doesn't just look one particular way and doesn't happen because of one particular reason. And if we look at it from that sense, if we look at it as this complicated thing that happens for many reasons and to many extremes to different folks, then I think we'll come at it in a more empathetic way, in a more thoughtful way, in a more, in just a better way. Yeah.
Thanks. And Emmy, do you have suggestions of how we can get the stories of people in the sex trade out in ways that feel that they respect full agency, self-determination, and so on, and safety also, because again, it can jeopardize safety.
Right. I mean, we're really struggling to do that. And so whenever people in the sex trade and sex worker activists speak out, and argue against some of those like really criminalizing, anti-trafficking policy that's focused on like building more prisons and putting more people in prison, the sex workers activists are dismissed instantly as saying like, oh, these are just like a top 2%, privileged, empowered sex worker, and their experiences don't reflect the reality of most people, and therefore they can be dismissed, and you don't need to listen to them. And I've had like anti-trafficking activists and people who are in professionals tell me that they will oppose some idea only because that's what the sex worker activists want, and not because that was a bad idea. And they say like, well, because any you can't like reward them, give them anything, and I think like doing the survey is a way to challenge that, and because we are really focusing on getting the stories from the community of color, from the trans communities, from the women who are working on the street and who are using drugs, so that these are not the privileged top 2% of the community, but none of them think that this anti-trafficking policies actually work or it's helpful, right? So, and I try to really look up to the Young Women's Empowerment Project because we see this as organizing. And I stress every time I do a survey, I tell people like we're not the academics from the outside who's coming to study you. We're not like we're not doing this for our career promotion, right? We're doing this because this we need the stories to change this whole narrative and challenge the narrative. And because when we go in and say, hey, my name is Emmy, and this is what I think, they'll totally dismiss me. But if I went there and say like, hey, my name is Emmy, and this is what 100 people are saying, and this is like, 15% trans people, like we have like this many people are, so these are not the super privileged, elite sex workers. They are the actual people who are struggling and suffering the consequences of the policies that's not based on reality. So I think that's, we're trying to do that. And one thing I told people when I say like, this is not academics like studying from outside, we said like, we're not going to publish academic papers about this, but we'll make a zine about it and then tell stories. Kind of like the Young Women's Empowerment Project did a zines on the Bad Encounter line, which is like documenting the people's experience of like violence and harassment from the institutions that are supposed to help us, right? I'm really using that. And there's a tension because we're paying people, and paying people was actually one of the goals for our work because we want to give people money, and because foundations won't directly give people money, so we need to do something to give people money, right? So that creates kind of like a transactional relationship, and I struggle with that. But I think that we're stressing that we're not paying you, well, like we just want to find an excuse to just redistribute wealth, right? And so this is one of the ways to do this.
Thank you, and I have to apologize, we're not going to have time for audience questions. We started a little bit late, so I just want to end with a quick question for everyone here. What is one thing that is bringing you joy right now? Adria is bringing me joy right now, too. So maybe we could start with Coco and Deye.
When I get to see my niece and nephew, when my sister calls, when she calls and she's in good spirits, because some days are not good for her. So when she's happy, or not happy, but in good spirits, then I feel better.
I like seeing my cousin, the new baby.
I'm really happy to be here, actually. I have friends and comrades here from all over the country, so I'm glad my part of presenting is done so I can just hang out for the rest of the day.
Yeah, I agree. I'm happy to be here. It's my first time here at AMC, so I'm excited to jump into some of the stuff that's going on today. Yeah.
Welcome. Adri.
Look at this. This is Adri. I call her Adri Nabebelina. So, yeah. Oh, by the way, I have my buttons and zines over here, so if you can come look at it if you're interested. And my business card is there too, and I can give you the postcards that I showed you. But anyway, or just see Adri.
Adri.
There's going to be a line afterwards, just to talk to Adri. Well, thank you everyone again for being here, for taking this time so early on a Friday. Be sure to come to tonight's opening ceremony and enjoy the rest of your AMC. Thanks.